All right, guys, we are going to be working on page 3 of the purchase agreement for this tutorial. So as you're following along, that starts with line 105. Again, the property address is going to be at the top of page 3. This talks about the duties of the parties. So the first part of this is that the brokers, their agents, employees, and associates make no representation or warranties to the physical condition of the property, its size, future value, or income potential, and that the sellers and buyers acknowledge that the sellers have a legal duty to disclose any material defects of which the seller has actual knowledge of and which a reasonable inspection by the buyer would not reveal. Okay. Condition of the property. So this is the part where we start to talk about federal law requires notification of potentially dangerous levels of lead-based paint. So anything built prior to 1978 requires the lead-based paint disclosure, of which you will need to complete. And then if applicable, the sellers will provide the buyers with copies of any records or prior testing that has been done. So that is required by Chapter 558A of the Iowa Code. All right. Inspections of the property. So this is where we start to talk about what inspection period we're going to be looking for the property. So you get to choose one. There's actually 3 options. You know how I love things to be in 3. So there's 3 options for how you are able to handle the inspections. And the first one, and probably the most common, is to put in a days that so how many days after the acceptance of this agreement does the buyer have to, at their expense, so the buyer pays for the inspection, have the property inspected by a qualified person of the buyer's choice to determine if there's any major structural, mechanical, environmental, roofing, plumbing, electrical, siding, lead-based paint, or other deficiencies existing in the property, which would constitute a hazard to any occupant. At the same time period, the buyers may notify the sellers in writing what requests, if any, are being made of the sellers to correct those deficiencies by the buyers as a result of the inspection. The sellers then have 3 days to notify the buyers in writing what steps, if any, that the seller will take, and then the buyers then have 2 days to respond. So the other piece of this is the second option is that the buyers acknowledge that they're taking the property as is, so in its current condition, and no repairs or corrections will be made by the seller. Or item 3 talks about that the buyers acknowledge that the sellers are selling the property as is. However, they do reserve the right to do an inspection at their expense if they would choose to do so within how many days? Anywhere from 10 days, 5 days, maybe was happening more in COVID. I would say be mindful of the length of time and the extent of the inspections that you intend to do, because if you limit yourself and say 5 days, we're not necessarily in a market that less days is an advantage like it was maybe during COVID. But make sure you're giving yourself enough time to get the proper inspectors in to do those services. I've seen it where people try to rush that and then they don't have enough information and the buyers maybe having a difficult time deciding, or just we go back to the seller and we don't have all the information that we might need. So this third part here just talks about, I accept that it's as is, but I have the right to an inspection. Now that one's fine and dandy. The trouble I see people getting into with the third one is that they do their inspection, they say, oh, we know it's as is, but we found all this stuff. And maybe the seller comes back and says, okay, well, I'll work with you on that. Well, the recommendation is, if that happens, is that you amend the purchase agreement and move it back into option line 124, the inspection period. Because what I've seen happen is that then there's no time frames around the I call it the as is but, number 3 for the inspection period. And so then there's just no time frame. So you're negotiating back and forth, or you get to closing and you still haven't really come up with a solution yet that both parties agree to. So if you are selecting number 3, please just remember that in the event the seller agrees to do something, make sure you get that in writing and signed by both parties as quickly as possible. That ends up on page 3 of the DMAAR purchase agreement, and your clients will initial at the bottom of that page.